You think your neighborhood is a sanctuary until the day three men in tailored suits decide to park a blacked-out SUV on your curb, clutching clipboards like they're carrying the holy scripture of suburban law, but little did they know they weren't into oppos. Just trespassing on my property. They were stepping into the crosshairs of a man who spent 12 years learning exactly how to dismantle a human being. My name is Elias Thorne, and I live in a quiet, windswept corner of the Pacific Northwest called Cedar Ridge, a place I chose specifically because it's one of the few remaining pockets of land where the word association is a dirty word, or at least it was supposed to be. After a decade in the SEAL teams and losing my wife to a fight she couldn't into oppos, went against a shadow on a lung scan. My only mission left in this life was my daughter, Maya, a 13-year-old fireball who'd rather spend her Saturdays digging for quartz in the creek than scrolling through TikTok. She's my compass, my North Star, and the reason I left the salt air of Coronado for the pine needles of the Cascades, thinking that here, the only thing we'd have to worry about was the occasional black bear in the trash cans. It all started on a Tuesday, one of those crisp mornings where the fog clings to the Douglas firs like a wet blanket, when I walked down to the mailbox and found a crisp, white envelope with a logo I'd never seen before. Cedar Ridge Estates Oversight Committee, The letter was written in that specific brand of passive-aggressive legalese that makes your skin crawl, claiming I was in violation of Code 402. Be regarding, unauthorized structural modifications, specifically, referring to the heavy-duty reinforced steel gate I'd installed on my driveway. They were demanding a $1,200, impact fee, payable within 48 hours, or they'd initiate a lien against my property. And I just stood there, the paper crinkling in my hand, laughing a dry, bitter laugh because I knew for a fact that Cedar Ridge had no HOA, no committee, and certainly no authority to tell me what kind of steel I could use to protect my home. I might have just tossed it in the shredder if it weren't into oppos. For my neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a retired clockmaker who's about 80 pounds soaking wet and has the kindest soul you've ever met, coming over to my porch shaking like a leaf. He had a letter too, but his was different. They were threatening to seize his vintage 1968 Mustang, the car he'd spent 40 years restoring with his late son, because it was deemed an eyesore in an open carport. As I sat him down and gave him a glass of water, watching his hands tremble, the old instincts, the ones I tried to bury in the garden years ago, started to itch under my skin like a phantom limb. I spent the next 3 hours on my laptop, digging through public records and tracing the Oversight Committee domain, only to find it was registered to a shell corporation out of Delaware with a mailing address that was nothing but a P.O. box in a strip mall. This wasn't oppos. A bureaucratic mistake. It was a predatory shakedown, a high-end scam designed to bleed elderly people and quiet families dry. But as I watched a black Suburban with tinted windows cruise slowly past my house for the third time that afternoon, I realized it was something much darker than a simple wire fraud. The next morning, the enforcers arrived in person, 3 guys who looked like they'd been cast as background thugs in a low-budget spy movie. Clean-cut, but with that unmistakable hardness behind the eyes, the kind of men who think a time makes them invisible. I was out front, sharpening a hatchet for some kindling, when the leader, a guy with a sharp jawline and a smile that didn't end oppos, reached his eyes, leaned over my fence and asked, Mr. Thorne? We in oppos hear about the gate. And we also need to verify the residency status of the minor living on the premises for the upcoming community census, The moment he mentioned Maya, the air in my lungs turned to ice, because in the world I came from, you don into oppos. Ask about a man's child unless you're measuring the distance for a strike. I looked him dead in the eye, my thumb tracing the edge of the blade, and I told him in a voice so quiet it sounded like gravel grinding together that he had 10 seconds to get his feet off my gravel before I stopped being civilian. He laughed a short, barking sound and patted his clipboard, telling me they'd be back with, enforcement officers, to ensure compliance. But as they walked away, I saw the guy in the back, the one with the cauliflower ear and the scarred knuckles, flick his gaze toward the upstairs window where Maya was doing her homework. I didn't in oppos sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the dark living room with my old service comms and a pot of black coffee, watching my perimeter cameras and seeing the shadows move in the trees. These Warren and Oppos, HOA enthusiasts, they were a professional snatch and grab crew using the HOA cover to scout homes and map out exits, and they'd clearly marked my house as the big prize. Around 2 p.m. the following day, the hammer dropped when I saw them marching up Mr. Henderson's driveway across the street, not with clipboards this time, but with bolt cutters and a look of pure aggression. I saw Henderson come out, waving his cane, trying to protect his garage, and that's when the tall one pushed him hard, sending the old man sprawling into the dirt. I was already through my front door before Henderson even hit the ground, my boots hitting the pavement with a rhythmic thud that felt like a drumbeat of war. End quote. Step away from him, end quote. I roared, and the three of them turned, the leader sneering as he realized I was alone, or so he thought. He started talking about, end quote, legal seizure, end quote, and end quote, interference with official duties, end quote. But I wasn't Oppos. Listening to the words anymore. I was watching their feet, their weight distribution, the way the two on the flanks were beginning to circle me. Just then, the front door of my house creaked open and Maya stepped out, calling, end quote, Dad? What an Oppos. Es the noise? End quote. And the world slowed down in that hyper-focused tunnel vision I hadn't into Oppos. Felt since a night raid in Ramadi. The lead guy looked at her, nodded to his buddy, and said, end quote, grab the kid, we'll use her to negotiate the gate code, end quote. And that was the last mistake he would ever make in a state of physical wholeness. The big one lunged from my porch, his hand reaching out like a claw. But I was faster. I am a ghost when I need to be. I caught him mid-stride, my shoulder driving into his solar plexus with the force of a freight train, and as he bent over gasping for air, I brought my knee up with everything I had. The sound of his patella shattering was like a dry branch snapping in the woods, a sickening crunch that echoed off the surrounding houses. He hit the ground wailing, clutching a leg that would never walk a straight line again. But I didn't into Oppos. Stopped to watch. The second one, the guy with the prison ink on his neck, tried to tackle me from the side, but I dropped low, let his momentum carry him over my shoulder, and as he fell, I drove my heel straight down onto his outstretched kneecap. It didn't end Oppos. Just break. It disintegrated under 200 pounds of focused muscle and fury, leaving him screaming in the gravel, his leg bent at an angle that shooed into Oppos. Exists in nature. The leader was the only one left standing, his smug expression replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror as he realized he wasn't Oppos. Dealing with a suburban dad, but a predator who had been forced out of retirement. He reached into his jacket, maybe for a piece, maybe for pepper spray. I didn't in Oppos. Care. I closed the gap in 2 steps, grabbed his wrist, and twisted until I heard the radius and ulna pop like bubble wrap. And as he began to fall, I delivered one final, precise kick to the side of his knee. He collapsed into a heap next to his partners. 3 men in suits now reduced to broken, crawling things, dragging themselves toward the street like wounded animals as the neighbors started pouring out of their houses with their phones held high. I stood over them, my chest barely heaving, and looked down at the leader whose face was buried in the dirt. End quote. This ISN and Oppos. An HOA violation, end quote. I whispered, loud enough for every camera to hear, end quote. This is a lesson in biology. You come for a man in Oppos. Family, you lose the privilege of standing on 2 feet. End quote. The police arrived 10 minutes later, sirens screaming, but they didn't in Oppos. Find a crime scene where I was the villain. They found 3 men with active warrants for human trafficking and interstate fraud, men who had been using this, end quote, fake HOA, end quote, tactic across 4 states to abduct children and strip houses. But the real twist came when the sheriff in Oppos' department raided the, end quote, oversight committee, end quote, office and found the paper trail. It wasn't in Oppos. Some distant syndicate. The person who had provided the names, the schedules, and the tip that I was a, end quote, wealthy widower with a vulnerable daughter, end quote, was the very person who had been, end quote, fine, end quote, first to set the stage. It was Mr. Henderson's own daughter, a woman who wanted the house and the inheritance early and didn't in Oppos. Care who she had to sell out to get it. As I sat on my porch that evening, holding Maya close while the forensic teams process the scene across the street. I realize that the fences we build aren't into oppos. T just for the strangers at the gate, but for the rot that can grow right in your own backyard. Cedar Ridge is quiet again, but the black stains on the pavement where those men crawled away are still there, a permanent reminder to anyone who thinks they can play in quote, enforcer in quote, in this neighborhood. But now I have to ask you, if you saw your neighbor being bullied by a system that felt wrong, would you wait for the paperwork to clear, or would you take the law into your own hands to protect what an oppos? As yours? Did I go too far by taking their ability to walk? Or is it the only language men like that understand? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think I'm a hero or just another man who let the darkness back in. Don and Oppos. T, forget to like and subscribe for more stories from the Ridge, because trust me, this wasn't Oppos. T, the only secret buried in these woods.